Americans For Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans For Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, March 22nd, 2019. There's a growing consensus that there's a need to increase IRS enforcement actions. Now, before discussing that, let's examine a few things. First, the IRS's actual expenditures were $11.5 billion for overall operations in fiscal year 2017. That's down from more than $11.7 billion in fiscal year 2016. In fiscal year 2017, the IRS used 76,832 full-time equivalent positions in conducting its work. That's a decrease of 14.9% from 2012. Women represented 65.5% of IRS and Chief Counsel personnel, compared to 48.1% in the overall civilian labor force. Now let's take a look at some IRS enforcement actions. This information is from the IRS Data Book. The IRS audited about 1.1 million tax returns. Now that's approximately 0.5% of all returns filed in calendar year 2016. The IRS conducted the majority of fiscal year 2017 audits, a whopping 70.8% of them via correspondence. The remaining 29.2% were conducted in the field. Of the almost 1.1 million examinations of tax returns, almost 34,000 resulted in additional refunds to the taxpayer, totaling more than $6 billion. It's interesting that we're supposed to believe that only 34,000 of the 1.1 million returns, or 3% of the audited returns, resulted in refunds. It's also interesting that about 70% of the audits were not done in person, but handled through the mail. Only about 330,000 of the 1.1 million returns that were actually audited were audited in the field. Let's take a quick look at how the IRS is viewed by the American people. An article in the Washington Examiner quoted from a Pew Research poll and found that the IRS was not liked by the American people. Surprise, surprise. In this poll, only the VA had a higher negative rating than the IRS, making the IRS the second most disliked agency in the entire federal government. How about a little IRS humor? You know, one of the things that most illustrates how people regard a government agency is the jokes that circulate about it. These were found on the internet. Why did the post office just recall their newest stamps? Well, they had pictures of IRS agents on them and people couldn't figure out which side to spit on. How are an apple and an IRS agent alike? They both look good hanging from a tree. What's the difference between an IRS agent and a carp? One's a bottom-feeding scumsucker and the other's a fish. If a lawyer and an IRS agent were both drowning and you could only save one of them, what would you do? Go to lunch or read the newspaper? What did the terrorist who hijacked a jumbo jet full of IRS agents do? He threatened to release one every hour if his demands weren't met. What do you call 25 IRS agents buried up to their chins in cement? Not enough cement. What do you throw to a drowning IRS agent? His co-workers, of course. Mercy. Let's take a look now at President Trump's proposal. Bernie Becker wrote in Politico's Morning Tax News about the proposal in President Trump's latest budget to help strengthen the IRS. It provides $290 million for information technology improvements and a request for $15 billion in tax enforcement legislation that the White House said would raise about $47 billion in new revenue over a decade. Senator Pat Roberts, a member of the Finance Committee, noted that the enforcement proposal, quoting here, doesn't excite me too much given the past history of what we've had to investigate, end quote. That, of course, a nod to the IRS's Tea Party controversy. Senator John Neely Kennedy, chairman of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees the IRS, was non-committal about the enforcement legislation and the idea that added enforcement could more than pay for itself with new revenues. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, said Kennedy, who once headed Louisiana's Revenue Department. Secretary Mnuchin told reporters that his major focus with the IRS is boosting the IT budget, and even Kevin Brady of Texas said this week that Congress should be willing to listen to new funding requests for the IRS. In conclusion, if the IRS is so widely disliked and almost always ridiculed, why would funding for this agency be increased? Is it because the reality is starting to percolate up from the swamp that the growing evasion of the income payroll tax system is threatening to show just how ineffective their cash cow is at funding the government? One thing the bureaucrats will not overlook is having insufficient money to, first, protect their jobs and their generous benefit packages, and second, to fund their programs. The swamp and their minions have been able to blithely ignore all economic reality and borrow to cover up the rapidly increasing gap between what is owed under the income payroll tax system and what is actually collected, commonly called the tax gap. Like the ancient Roman dictators that tried to placate and distract their populace by putting on endless spectacles and providing quantities of food, the swamp assumes that no one will look at their self-serving pursuit of profit at the expense of the rest of us if we're not prodded awake. However, the swamp and their minions know that increasing funding for the IRS is a dangerous move. As long as the audit rates continue to decrease and there were fewer stories about IRS abuse, then there was no cause for the rest of us to question why we need to keep putting up with this inefficient and harmful income payroll tax system. Actually, this increased funding for the IRS will likely accelerate the move to the fair tax. As Abraham Lincoln once said, the best way to get a bad law repealed is to enforce it strictly. Now, most employees of the IRS are just doing their job, and they don't have the evil intentions that many ascribe to them. However, they have an almost impossible job. The only way to collect more money is to take more and more active enforcement actions and to strictly enforce the law. This means more and more people are going to feel the force of IRS audits and collection efforts. This will lead to more and more upset. More and more upset will lead to demands for change. Now, many in the swamp and their minions are uncomfortable with the increased funding, but they believe they don't have a choice. They know that if enough money doesn't get through to D.C. through the income payroll tax system and the cost of borrowing continues to escalate, they will have to cut back some of the benefits that many of us have come to rely on for our lives. They know, just like in Rome when the food ran out, the rest of us will realize how we've been conned for too long, and our outrage and revenge will not be pleasant for them. Yes, increased funding and IRS enforcement is going to lead to greater awareness of the people, and with that greater awareness will come a demand for a better and fairer tax system, i.e., the fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org or bigsolution.org.